This is the Sony a7C, and while it may not seem like it at first, this is a very important camera. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I toss coins to the Witcher. Okay, first up, as usual, some disclosure. Sony loaned me this camera to conduct this review. I've had it for a couple weeks now. I don't get to keep it, no money changed hands, and Sony does not get creative input, nor do they get to see this video before it's posted. Now, when I say this is an important camera, it's not because it has impressive new specs or features you haven't seen before. In fact, in many ways, it's nearly identical to the 2-year-old a7 III. What makes it important is how this reduction in size and amalgamation of features we've seen on other Sony cameras suggests both a larger potential user base and a higher ceiling for future camera capabilities. Historically, in computer hardware development, the process was to make something new and powerful, regardless of size, as a first step, and then make it smaller, which then allowed you to combine more of those new, smaller things to make a new, big, powerful thing before once again making it smaller. This back and forth is how we get steady advancements in technology. So even though a camera like this might seem kind of boring to a current a7 III owner, I find it exciting, because if they can cram all the stuff from pretty much every other Sony camera prior to the a7S III into this tiny body, then what are they going to be able to do next year with a full-size camera? And when I say tiny body, I mean it. This is the smallest full-frame camera on the market, if you don't count the Sigma FP, and I think it's reasonable to exclude the Sigma FP because that camera doesn't have a viewfinder or a mechanical shutter. This camera is about the size of my a6600, but weighs only 517 grams, so just over a pound, with a battery and a card inserted. It has a decent grip for its size, but it's a bit shallower than I'm used to, and there are definitely some trade-offs for having this reduced size, which we'll get into in a moment. But a couple things they got right are keeping a nice distance between the tripod plate and the battery door while centering it under the lens, and maintaining a full featured set of inputs and outputs without needing to hide the card slot in with the battery. And it also keeps the FZ100 battery from the a7 III, so you're getting great compatibility and excellent battery life. I managed to get 3 hours of 4K 24p video with autofocus and stabilization on a full charge before the battery died. And for photos, I still had over 80% battery remaining after taking 150 shots spread out over a few hours. You can extend that battery life over USB-C, but don't expect the infinite runtime you get with the a7S III's power delivery. On this camera, it's more of a trickle charge, merely doubling your runtime to about 6 hours of video, which is still quite good and probably plenty for most people. They removed the USB micro B port though, which isn't an issue for me, but it's something you should consider if you use a lot of remotes or accessories that require that port. It uses the same micro HDMI port we've seen on the previous Sony cameras, and the card slot is a single UHS-2 SD card, so no backup recording like you get on the a7 III. For audio, it has both a microphone and a headphone jack, and they're smartly separated with the microphone flap not blocking the flip-out screen, two features that are obviously big wins for self-filming. Now, the screen isn't anything new. It's pretty much the a7 III screen all over again, with the same limited touch controls and modest size. But now, it's fully articulating. But that means we're not getting the new a7S III menu system and touch operation. It's the previous UI. One thing I really appreciate though is how they position the HDMI port at the bottom of the I/O with the door opening downwards so that it doesn't interfere too much with your ability to rotate the screen. You only lose about 30 degrees of swivel instead of the nearly 180 degrees that I lost on the Panasonic S5. Also, these doors are much better than the a7 III's dangling flaps. And despite all these changes, they've maintained the weather resistance of their other recent full-frame cameras instead of being reduced to the weaker resistance you'd find on Sony's APS-C bodies. So that's great. And while we're talking about these ports, let's have a listen to the audio to see if it sounds any different than it does on the a7 III. Okay, so I'm going to start with the a7 III because I have a lot more experience with that one and know what to expect from its audio. And I've just got a line coming out from my regular audio setup and then coming into the camera here. And I'm going to set the levels so that check, 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 they land between -12 and -6. And for me, that is 2. So I have the audio record level set to 2, which is good. That should be, you know, minimal preamp noise. Now let's go ahead and set it up on this camera so we can see what we're dealing with here. And then I will record on both and switch back and forth so you can hear it. Check, 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 check. Okay, so interestingly, on the a7C, I had to set the audio record level to 8. So that might increase the amount of noise that we perceive. It's interesting that I had to put more gain in this camera. I guess the preamps are less powerful, or at least it's calibrated on its scale to be less powerful, where 8 is similar to 2 over here. Okay, so let me tell you about today's sponsor, Storyblocks, and I'll switch back and forth on the audio. So you know when you're editing a video and you realize you didn't get that shot of the chickens kicking the leaves in the woods that you really needed to sell your story, and to go out and get that shot would just be logistically or budgetarily unfeasible, well, Storyblocks has you covered with not only chicken footage, but a wide range of subject matter with unlimited downloads and 4K video. They're also amply supplied with backgrounds, overlays, and After Effects templates, and the interface is easy to use and navigate, and the clips are royalty-free for both personal and commercial use, so you can use them as much as you want, wherever you want. So if you think you could take advantage of a fantastic library of quality stock footage and effects, check out Storyblocks using the link in the description below. The audio controls are identical to the a7 III, and the camera is outfitted with the same multi-interface shoe, so it accepts Sony's audio devices that go in the hot shoe. It has a new shutter button and on-off switch combo, which I really like. It depresses nicely with a good degree of travel, and the on-off switch is more challenging to flick than on the a7 III, which should prevent some of the accidental ons that happen on those older cameras. The buttons and dials that it does have are refined, well-sized, and nice to use, including this large AF on button, which is very pleasing to depress, and which now activates the real-time tracking feature that is missing on the a7 III. This body is missing custom buttons though, and only has 2 dials instead of 3, so adjusting exposure is very similar to the smaller APS-C bodies, but you'll have to rely entirely on the quick menu function button to access your favorite settings, because there's no custom buttons like C1 or C2. I honestly thought I was going to hate using this camera for that reason, but I did get comfortable using the function menu after just about a day. The only thing I didn't get used to or come to enjoy is this viewfinder. It is terrible. Not only is it dated in its resolution and speed, but it doesn't have a proper eyepiece, just this rubberized edge, which is uncomfortable and doesn't give shade from ambient light. It's not a pleasant experience to use, but surprisingly it does have a diopter wheel for adjustment. As I tested this camera more and more, I started to feel like it was a step back for photography, but a step forward for video compared to the a7 III. The a7C definitely benefits from the latest autofocus system with real-time AF and animal IAF, but the worse viewfinder, lack of dual card slots, fewer buttons and dials, and the shallower grip make this a worse photography experience, in my opinion. And since it uses the layout from the APS-C bodies instead of its full-frame counterparts, that means no joystick, and instead all of the work is loaded onto this wheel on the back. I've gotten used to this for my a6600, but I definitely prefer the a7 III's layout more. Also, when it comes to the shutter, while it does have the silent shooting option using the electronic shutter, you don't have control over the electronic front curtain when in mechanical mode, which for me resulted in the electronic front curtain always being on. This produces less shutter shock because you only feel half of the full actuation, but this causes issues with third-party flashes like those from Godox that don't fire reliably when electronic front curtain is enabled. On the a7 III, you can turn this off and go full mechanical, but you can't seem to on this camera. So consider that if you use Godox or similar flashes. Also, this shutter caps out at 1/4000th of a second versus the 1/8000th you get on the a7 III. Now we do get some of the improvements we've seen on the a7 III's successors though, like a better illuminated focus selection instead of that hard to see gray box, and the inclusion of auto white balance lock. And it's also inherited some of the new additions we saw on the a7S III, like the new mode dial layout for faster switching between photo and video, the ability to control the file naming and structure so not all your video files are named C0001, and when setting a custom white balance, you can move the box around to refine your target better, just like we saw on the a7S III. And the white balance reading is more accurate on the a7C compared to the a7 III, which complements this camera's improved colors, but we'll talk more about color in a moment. However, you still can't set a custom white balance while in one of the memory recall modes. But perhaps the best thing it inherited from the a7S III is the new video autofocus adjustments, with the ability to choose between 7 steps of transition speed and 5 steps of responsiveness. And it also has the new transition curves with the ramped toe and knee to give a more organic focus pull. The over and under exposure range for face detection is the same as the a7 III, which is about 4 stops over and 6 stops under, but the a7C performs better in that range. Firstly, it uses eye detection in video instead of just face, and it doesn't seem to get lost as easy as the a7 III when underexposed. I was shooting 4 to 5 stops underexposed with a bright light behind the subject in S-Log2, and it kept focused the entire time, where the a7 III struggled. So this camera is definitely up there as one of Sony's best autofocus systems. And unlike the a7 III, it doesn't have any of the weird HDMI quirks where connecting a monitor disables face detection, at least not in 24p. In 30p, it performs like the ZV-1, where it crops in and you get this wide autofocus box instead of face detection, but that's only when recording internally and monitoring over HDMI simultaneously. If you record only externally, you keep eye detection in 30p, but again, neither is an issue in 24p, and neither screen goes black when you start recording like it does on the a7 III. So there's some serious improvements and quirk reduction here. It does still have that same issue that plagues even the A7S III though, which is that when you enable your on-screen display and menus over HDMI, the camera LCD turns off. This probably won't affect a large number of users, but it's something I hope Sony continues to work on because it would be nice to see fixed in future cameras. Perhaps the biggest improvement in recording video over the A7 III, however, is the fact that this camera has no record limits, so you don't need an external recorder to bypass any 30-minute limit, or to even see yourself now. So that's great if you want a tiny setup for long-form content. And overheating doesn't appear to be a problem for those long recording sessions either, despite this tiny body. I put the auto power off temp to high, and then let it record for 6 hours in a 24 degrees Celsius environment, which is 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and it didn't even give me an overheating warning, so that's great. But your mileage will probably vary in hotter environments. So those are a lot of the differences and improvements over the A7 III, but unfortunately, the reason why I'm comparing it to the A7 III so much is because the sensor and image performance are, for better or worse, the same. So that means you're getting the same 24 megapixel still images and the same super sampled 6K into 4K video, which is the good part because those Sony images are rich, sharp, and detailed, but it also means you're still stuck with 8-bit video with 420 subsampling internally and limited to 4K 24 or 4K 30 with a slight crop. It's using the same codecs with the same bit rates and has the same pretty terrible rolling shutter performance. And those are, of course, the biggest disappointments because the two major flaws with the A7 III, in my opinion, are the rolling shutter and the 8-bit color, and that's also true with this camera. The image stabilization is pretty similar too, which can actually be considered an impressive feat that they achieved almost the same level of stabilization as the A7 III, but in this much smaller body. I'm told they had to completely redesign the system, and in my tests for photography, I was able to get pretty similar results. I could get down to about 1/8 of a second shutter speed at 70mm on both cameras, but in video, I did find the A7C to be a bit more shaky than the A7 III when walking with them. I was walking with both cameras on a rig using the same unstabilized lens on both, and while the results are close, the A7C does look worse. So while I'm again impressed at what they've been able to shrink down, I'm not overly impressed by the video stabilization in a vacuum. But that seems reasonable because the A7 III didn't have that impressive stabilization itself. This is definitely a step back after seeing what the A7S III is capable of. And because the sensor is the same, we're seeing pretty much the same dynamic range. The A7C is tuned a bit differently, and it actually scored about 1/3 of a stop better on my Xyla 21 test. Thanks again to DSC Labs for providing that chart, and thanks to Imatest for providing the noise analysis software. When comparing practical examples, the dynamic range seems effectively the same, and neither pulls ahead in the highlights, but when closely evaluating the noise, especially in a situation where the shadows were lifted, the A7C does seem to have slightly less noise and cleaner shadows. So I imagine that's how it scored better than the A7 III, by having 1/3 of a stop better signal-to-noise ratio. But the ISO range is also different. On the A7 III, S-Log2 starts at ISO 800, but it starts at ISO 500 on the A7C. But when comparing the ISO range, it's important to realize that the A7C's ISO 500 isn't darker than the A7 III's ISO 800. I often hear people say that some new camera has a lower base ISO, so that'll be helpful for exposing outdoors in bright sunlight. That's not how it works. Between these two cameras, if your shutter speed and aperture are the same, ISO 500 on the A7C will expose very similarly to ISO 800 on the A7 III. So what you're actually getting is a shifting of the entire ISO range, which has two advantages. First off, this means the A7C will change to its second native ISO sooner than the A7 III. Because yes, even though Sony doesn't really advertise this, the A7 III has a second native ISO at around 5000 in S-Log2. Well, since everything on the A7C is shifted 2/3 of a stop lower, you'll hit your second native ISO at 3200 instead. And at certain ISOs, this can create a noticeable noise advantage for the A7C. And it also means that when both of these cameras cap out at ISO 51200, the A7C will be 2/3 of a stop brighter at that ISO. But to put it simply, expect to see anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of a stop better noise performance at certain ISOs, but outside of that, mostly similar dynamic range. There is something else I noticed though while moving through the ISO range. The issue where the A7 III's shadows tend to get really magenta at high ISOs has been mostly remedied on this camera. And I find that at many ISOs it retains a more natural look, but it would seem that they accomplished this by shifting to green instead, which itself can creep into the shot at higher ISOs. But when compared, I'd rather have the green, as I find it keeps the shot looking more believable and natural than the magenta. And that goes for color accuracy in general too. The A7C has more vibrant skin tones and a much more accurate blue range, creating a final image that is much more technically correct. I can't tell you which camera you'll like better, but I can say the A7C does noticeably better on the vector scope and requires fewer corrections right out of camera. And I personally prefer the skin tones on the new camera over the A7 III. And I think that's pretty much it. For everything else, if I didn't mention it, assume it's the same as the A7 III. Same zebras, same focus peaking, same clear image zoom, same menus, same slow motion modes, and so on. It really is just a smaller A7 III with a flip screen. But like I said in the beginning, that's enough to have me interested. And to be fair, ignoring some of the ergonomic inconveniences, in many ways it's a better camera than the A7 III, while taking up a smaller footprint, with fewer quirks and fewer restrictions. And I'm told it's going to be $200 cheaper than the A7 III, which would automatically suggest that it's a good value, if you think the A7 III is a good value. And back in 2018, I called the A7 III the best value camera I'd ever seen. And there's no doubt in my mind that if this camera came out in 2018, we probably would have called off our search for the perfect camera. But it's 2020, and we've seen the A7S III, so it's harder to be excited about 2018's perfect camera. And while this camera will likely bring more customers to Sony that want a smaller full-frame body, and also satisfy current Sony shooters that need a second body with fewer quirks, I'm more excited about what this camera suggests for the future. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful, and if you did, make sure to leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. All right, I'm done.